There are times when we all need reminders of any number of things. And as we're starting a new year, people have created maybe some goals or resolutions, or maybe even just subtle expectations for themselves. I wanted to share this reminder for you if you are on an emotional or trauma healing journey. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So, if you have been on this journey for really any length of time at all, even if it's been like a few weeks, you know that there are moments when you might feel good, excited, hopeful, have an aha moment. And then sometimes a day later, a week later, or maybe even just a minute later, there's something that happens and you may not even be aware of anything that happens. It might not be an external thing. It could be something shifting internally. All of that, like hopefulness, can disappear. And maybe there is some particular reason you're finding yourself thinking about something that takes that away. But sometimes it's just a shift energetically that happens. And when it happens, well, obviously it's not going to feel good, and it can make you doubt the healing journey itself and certainly your ability to get to where you ultimately want to be. And today I want to talk about one part of it is that is completely normal, but the other part is how and why that happens. Because I think that when we have an understanding of what is happening, we have more ability to kind of stop that momentum a little bit, or at least halt it, slow it down, so that it doesn't end up having quite as significant of an impact. So, no matter where you are on this healing journey, you're going to be affected by this. So whether you are literally just starting out, or you've been on the journey for a while, and that could be a year, it could be 20 years. And no matter where you are, so even if you feel like you're on the other side of healing, there will be times that this is going to be applicable to you, to all of us. It certainly is for me. So there are a lot of factors that go into how we feel on a day-to-day basis, how we respond and react to things, what we find ourselves thinking about. There are a lot of factors that go into that, and none of them are right or wrong or good or bad. That's just the reality. But there's something that can be present that significantly impacts how much all of that can impact you, or how all of that can feel. And that is our level of vulnerability. Now, you've probably heard me talk about how important vulnerability is for healing, that we have to be willing to risk being vulnerable in terms of trying new things, creating connection, and all of that is very real and true. Vulnerability is also kind of a baseline at any given moment of how, vulnerable we are to things and experiences within and around us. So an example of that is if you're not feeling well and something happens, and it doesn't have to be anything significant, it's going to have a little bit of a different impact on you, whatever that thing is, than it would if you were feeling physically really great, you got lots of sleep, you're not worried about anything. That thing may not even really register as any sort of negative thing whatsoever. But not feeling well physically, or not getting enough sleep, being stressed out about something, that thing is likely going to have a little bit more of an impact on you, or have an impact on you. It might be a little, it may be more significant, depending on how vulnerable you are. So if you got 6 hours of sleep versus 8 hours of sleep, and I don't know too many people that sleep 8 hours, but let's pretend. But you get 6 hours on a particular night, and you wake up and you feel kind of groggy, you don't feel rested, maybe you're worried about what that's going to mean for your day, and then that thing happens, you're going to feel more about that thing happening. It's going to have more of an impact on you than if you did. So even just a small shift like that has an impact. Now, if you don't get enough sleep and you are really stressed out about something coming up, that's going to multiply your level of vulnerability. So you've heard me talk about layers of wounding, layers of healing. The vulnerability that we experience in a day-to-day kind of way also kind of creates those layers. And so not getting enough sleep is one layer. Being stressed out about something coming up is another layer. Maybe not feeling physically very well, another layer. So it's not just that you have each of these layers that create that vulnerability. With each additional layer, just like with the experience of trauma, with each additional layer, each kind of stressor, in a sense, is multiplied. It's compounded. So you might find that you might be, like a few days into a week, and something relatively minor happens. Somebody changes plans, or something just didn't work out the way that you hoped it would. But it's not something really significant. We're not talking about like somebody walking away from your wedding or something like that. We're talking about just minor little things. If those things that are creating vulnerability are not addressed, maybe honored, maybe worked through, whatever might need to happen around that, that little thing can send you down a spiral. And you may not even recognize that any of that's happening. You may not even recognize that you went down that spiral. You might just notice feeling a lot of feeling, or maybe feeling completely numb and not really being sure why. You might even beat yourself up that you're in that place, particularly if you don't know why. Like, what is wrong with me? Why am I feeling like this? Nothing's happened. Well, the reality is that there are things that are happening. They don't have to be bad. Every stress creates vulnerability. So whether it's physical stress, emotional stress, even things that you're like looking forward to, anticipating, when it creates kind of that energy, that it can also be a stress. It doesn't have to be a negative thing, but all of those things compound the overall level of vulnerability. And what I'm talking about with vulnerability in this regard is the likelihood that things are going to impact you. Because even positive things create stress. So, whatever it is, a new job, a promotion, a new relationship, looking forward to something, getting married, or potentially getting divorced if that feels good to you, having a child or a new friendship, moving, buying your first home, like all of those things, some of those things, really all of those things that I just mentioned, tend to be like happy things that we look forward to, but they still create stress. And every stress that you're experiencing is a layer that adds to your vulnerability. So whatever that thing is likely going to impact you more, especially if you're unaware of how vulnerable you are, or even that you are vulnerable. So when you then find yourself feeling numb or feeling overwhelmed or having a really difficult time with something, or even maybe just a mildly difficult time, but are beating yourself up because you're feeling it, that adds more stress, more vulnerability. but it also reinforces all those core beliefs, right? That maybe you're not good enough, that it's never going to work, that you don't deserve to be happy, all that kind of stuff. And then you kind of get stuck because your mind just keeps playing over and over all those fears, doubts, and beliefs. So if you can recognize, am I feeling stressed out about something? Am I feeling vulnerable? Is there something that's happened that made me feel bad in some way, maybe hurt or disappointed? And I just kind of pushed it aside and told myself it's not a big deal and I shouldn't be upset about it. When we do that, and I've talked about this before too, when we do that, that creates a lot of natural vulnerability within us because we're feeling something, but we're, on the other hand, trying to deny that we're feeling it. So we're being very dismissive to ourselves, which is going to feel very familiar, which creates more vulnerability because that hurt, that disappointment, that betrayal, whatever it is more present, even if we're not consciously aware of it. And so often, and this is just a natural thing for people to think, that, well, I'm not thinking about it, so it's not really bothering me. And that really isn't true. Now, on one hand, it does make sense that that would be the case. But for most of us, anybody who's experienced some difficult things that they haven't yet healed, much of the time we are bothered by a lot of things that we're not consciously aware of. It may be things that we've experienced that we haven't yet healed, but it might be things in our everyday life that we experience that has an impact, but we're not aware that it's had an impact. And those types of things create even more vulnerability than if we recognize it. Because if we recognize it, then we're able to mitigate to a degree, now depending on how long you've been on the journey and what skills you have available, how practiced you are at those skills, will determine how well, or how, not necessarily how well, how well it's going to work for you, because the more practice you have, the more effective it's going to be. So effective is probably a better word there. So when you're aware, you can do something. You can practice some of those skills. When you're not aware, the impact, that moment hits deeper at that core level, connecting to those core beliefs. And often fears of not being good enough, fears of not being able to heal. So it really is important both to be able to work to be aware of what's going on with you day to day, and being compassionate with yourself when you feel like you're not performing, for lack of a better word, in the way that you feel like you should. If you feel like, well, I should be happy because all this stuff is going on, but I'm not, and there's something wrong with me. Well, maybe there's something kind of under the surface that's creating difficulty for you being happy. And the reality is, for a lot of trauma survivors, when things are going really well, that can bring up a lot of stuff if you haven't yet healed it. Because there's fears around that, there's doubts around it, there's unworthiness around it. And all of that is part of the vulnerability. So one of the ways that you can become aware of the vulnerability is just to start practicing checking in with yourself every day. And maybe it's at the beginning of your day or at the end of your day. The more consistent you are with when you tend to do this, the more effective it's going to be. So I tend to do it at the end of the day. I think practicing it at the end of the day can be good because all that stuff is likely going to be on your mind, even if subconsciously. And you can kind of do a little bit of a roundup before you go to bed. So just checking in with yourself, and ideally maybe journaling about it and thinking about, how are you feeling? Just start there. How am I feeling? And maybe you can't name a specific feeling, and that's okay. You don't necessarily have to be able to do that. But would you say that you're feeling more positive or not so positive? Like if you were to circle one of the like emojis, would it be a happy face or a not so happy face? Like you can start there. And if it's a happy face, what is it about the day? What is it about what's happened or that you've been thinking about that makes you feel that way? Because hopefully there are some of those days, or at least moments in those days. If it's not a happy face, what's happened in that day? And maybe it's just things that you found yourself thinking about. It doesn't have to be that something's actually happened. So being able to identify that. What happened today? What have I found myself thinking about? Maybe it's some specific memories. Maybe it's fears. Maybe it's worrying about something coming up. Maybe all of the above. And just noticing that. And if it's purely just not a happy face, so even just that is an indicator that you're vulnerable. And if you recognize that there are maybe a few different things, or maybe the things that you've been thinking about are particularly difficult, and maybe they're particularly difficult because they're related to trauma and betrayal and that kind of thing, or maybe they're difficult because they just create a lot of stress and worry. But the more significant that betrayal or memory or trauma or worry is, the more vulnerable you are. So practicing becoming aware of that sort of thing can be really helpful, because then if you're able, and this takes practice, when you recognize, okay, I'm feeling a little bit more vulnerable today, then you can be more mindful of practicing self-compassion, which is incredibly important. And you can also be a little bit more proactive about doing things that can help shift some of that vulnerability, whether it's just kind of mitigating the vulnerability or actually moving through it so that it's not still creating vulnerability for you. And that might be different depending on what the particular circumstance is. But the more aware we become, the more availability we have to do something with it. Because part of the reason that we are so deeply and profoundly affected by childhood trauma is because we are unaware that we are affected by it, or how deeply we are affected by it. Because so much of our coping is about, I'm okay. It's not a big deal, right? Minimizing, rationalizing, denying. It could be worse. So I would really love to hear from you. What do you tend to be aware? If you do find yourself, maybe you wouldn't identify it as feeling vulnerable, but if you do find yourself maybe struggling with something a little bit, do you tend to be compassionate, or do you tend to be critical and harsh with yourself because you shouldn't be struggling? It shouldn't be bothering you anymore. There will be times in our lives, no matter where you are in this healing journey, that things will bother you. Because there are going to be times that you don't get enough sleep, you're worried about something, you're not feeling well. There might be something really tragic that you're having to deal with in your current life. And certainly if you're watching this, there's likely a lot of tragic things in your past that you're probably still trying to heal from. And that by itself creates a significant amount of underlying vulnerability, even on good days. So share your thoughts, your experiences in the comments. Journaling really can be helpful with this. So any kind of journal, completely blank pages. Ideally, you would be writing, but if typing is better for you, then that's the only way that you'll do it, then by all means do that. But if you can write, that really is better. It helps process It helps move some of that energy because you're literally moving with it and you're connecting with the words more. So, with the experience more. So, try that. I know it's not easy. Journaling can feel confrontational in a way. And especially if you're working with a therapist, I would encourage you to journal because that is something that you can take with you into the therapy. And that can be really helpful. So if you're interested, there is a new kind of a daily journal that I have created that takes some of these things into consideration. But it's kind of just a thing to help you check in with yourself and actually help shift ultimately what you believe about who you are. So there will be a link to that in the description. Thanks so much for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe, click the bell for notifications. And if you found it helpful, give it a thumbs up. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.